In 1959, saying one name could cost you $350,000. Kirk Douglas knew this because the studio had warned him the day before, if you mention Dalton Trumbo's name in the press, the Spartacus distribution deal is cancelled. Kirk sat at that morning's press conference facing more than 200 journalists. His lawyers flanked him on both sides. Edward Lewis, his producing partner, sat behind him drenched in sweat. Because everyone knew, a journalist was going to ask that question. And Kirk Douglas's answer would either end his own career or break Hollywood's 10-year blacklist regime. Or cause him to be destroyed. If you want to discover how one man's decision in mere seconds changed an entire industry forever, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. This story gets darker before it gets better. The ballroom of the Beverly Hilton felt smaller than it actually was that January morning. Kirk Douglas had walked into press conferences before, hundreds of them, but never one where the air itself seemed to press against his chest. The chandelier lights were too bright. Someone had opened the windows but no breeze came through. 200 faces stared at him from folding chairs arranged in tight rows. Cameras lined the back wall. Flashbulbs were already popping even though nothing had happened yet. Edward Lewis sat 3 feet behind Kirk, and if you looked closely, you could see his hands trembling as he gripped his notepad. Lewis was the money man, the one who had convinced Universal Pictures to bankroll Spartacus with a budget that made executives nervous. $12 million. The kind of number that could sink a studio if the film failed. And right now, in this room, failure wasn't just possible. It was one sentence away. Kirk's lawyers had positioned themselves like bodyguards. Morton Levy on his right, a contract specialist who had spent the previous night going through every clause of the distribution agreement. Harold Berkman on his left, the studio's liaison, whose job was to make sure Kirk said nothing that would trigger the cancellation clause. Both men had told him the same thing that morning over breakfast: do not answer questions about the writer. Deflect. Move on. Protect the film. But Kirk Douglas wasn't thinking about protection. He was thinking about a man who wasn't in the room. A man whose name had been erased from Hollywood for 10 years. A man who had written one of the most powerful scripts Kirk had ever read, but whose credit would appear nowhere on the film if certain people had their way. Hedley Donovan sat in the 3rd row. He wasn't just any journalist. He was the editorial director of Time Incorporated, which meant his publications could make or break a film's public perception before it even reached theaters. Donovan had flown in from New York specifically for this press conference. He had told his team he wanted to ask one particular question. He had told them he wanted to watch Kirk Douglas squirm. The room settled into an uneasy quiet. A studio publicist stepped to a microphone at the side of the stage and began the standard introduction: epic film, groundbreaking production, star-studded cast. Kirk barely heard the words. He was watching the journalists, trying to figure out which one Donovan had planted his question with. Because that's how it worked in 1959. Powerful editors didn't ask questions themselves. They had their people do it, so they could claim innocence later. Lou Wasserman stood in the back corner of the room, partially hidden behind a pillar. Wasserman ran MCA, the most powerful talent agency in Hollywood, and he had brokered the deal that put Kirk Douglas in the producer's chair for Spartacus. But Wasserman had also made it clear, I can't protect you if you go rogue on this blacklist thing. He had said it casually, the way someone mentions the weather, but Kirk understood the weight behind those words. Protection in Hollywood wasn't about bodyguards or lawyers. It was about who would return your phone calls after you made the wrong enemy. The first few questions were softballs. How did you prepare for the role? What was it like working with such a large cast? Kirk answered them mechanically, his voice steady but his mind elsewhere. He could feel the real question hovering in the room like smoke. Every journalist knew what they wanted to ask. Every journalist also knew what asking it might cost them. Then it happened. A man in the 5th row stood up. He didn't wait to be called on. He just stood and his voice cut through the manufactured politeness of the press conference like a blade. Mr. Douglas, there's been a lot of speculation about the screenplay. Can you tell us who actually wrote Spartacus? The room didn't gasp. That would have been too dramatic, too obvious. Instead, it did something worse. It went completely silent. The kind of silence where you can hear fabric rustling, where you can hear someone's watch ticking 3 chairs away. The kind of silence that feels like suffocation. Morton Levy's hand shot to Kirk's arm, fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks. Harold Berkman leaned forward, his breath hot against Kirk's ear. "Don't answer that. Move to the next question." Edward Lewis stood up behind them, ready to intervene, to claim technical difficulties, to do anything to stop what was about to happen. But Kirk Douglas had already decided. Not in that moment. He had decided weeks earlier, maybe months earlier, possibly the first time he read Dalton Trumbo's script and realized he was holding something that deserved to exist in the light. He had decided when he visited Trumbo's house in the middle of the night, when they worked on revisions in secret, when Trumbo handed him pages under a false name because using his real one could destroy them both. The Hollywood blacklist had started in 1947, though its roots went deeper. The House Un-American Activities Committee had decided that communism was infiltrating American entertainment, and they wanted names. Witnesses were called. Some people cooperated, gave up their colleagues, pointed fingers to save themselves. Others refused. Dalton Trumbo refused. He was cited for contempt of Congress. He served nearly a year in federal prison. And when he got out, he discovered that his name had been added to a list of writers, directors, and actors who would never work in Hollywood again. Except Trumbo didn't stop working. He just stopped signing his name. He wrote under pseudonyms. He sold scripts through fronts. He won an Academy Award in 1956 for a screenplay credited to someone else. The entire industry knew what was happening, but the entire industry also participated in the lie because breaking the blacklist meant challenging the people who controlled everything, the studio heads, the production companies, the distribution networks that decided which films played in which theaters. Kirk Douglas had the power to challenge them because he had become something rare in Hollywood, a star with leverage. He wasn't just an actor anymore. He was a producer. He had his own production company, Brenna Productions, named after his mother. He had the ability to greenlight projects, to hire writers, to put names on contracts. And he had chosen to put Dalton Trumbo's real name on the Spartacus contract. But a contract clause and a public acknowledgement were two different things. Universal Pictures had agreed to the contract because it was private, internal, something that could be explained away if necessary. A public statement at a press conference was permanent. It would be in newspapers the next morning. It would be on radio broadcasts by evening. It would be something that couldn't be taken back. Hedley Donovan was smiling now. Not a big smile, just a slight upturn at the corners of his mouth. He had Kirk exactly where he wanted him. Either Kirk would lie, which would damage his reputation and raise more questions, or he would tell the truth, which would trigger the cancellation clause and potentially kill the film. Either way, Time magazine would have its story. Either way, someone lost. Kirk Douglas looked at the journalist who had asked the question. He looked at Donovan. He looked at Lou Wasserman in the back corner, whose face had gone completely blank. He looked at his lawyers, who were now standing, ready to pull him away from the microphone. He looked at Edward Lewis, whose entire financial future was tied to this film. And then Kirk Douglas leaned forward into the microphone. The movement was small, just a few inches, but it felt seismic. Because everyone in that room understood what it meant. He wasn't deflecting. He wasn't moving to the next question. He was answering. The screenplay for Spartacus, Kirk said, his voice clear and deliberate, was written by Dalton Trumbo. 3 words. Written by Dalton Trumbo. 11 syllables that shattered a decade of enforced silence. The room erupted. Not with applause, that would come later, from different people in different places. In that moment, the room erupted with chaos. Journalists started shouting questions over each other. Cameras clicked rapidly. Someone knocked over a chair. Morton Levy was yelling something, but Kirk couldn't hear it over the noise. Harold Berkman had already left, practically running toward the exit where studio executives were waiting. Lew Wasserman didn't move from his position behind the pillar. He just watched. His expression gave nothing away, but people who knew him understood that his stillness was more dangerous than anyone else's panic. Wasserman was calculating. He was already running through scenarios, figuring out which relationships could be salvaged, which deals would fall apart, which enemies were about to be made. Edward Lewis sat back down. The sweat on his forehead had turned cold. He had just watched his producing partner potentially destroy everything they had built. $12 million. 2 years of production. Thousands of people's jobs. All of it hanging in the balance because Kirk Douglas had said 3 words. But something else was happening too, something that wouldn't be fully understood until later. Studio executives were making phone calls. Distribution networks were having emergency meetings. The people who had enforced the blacklist for 10 years were suddenly facing a problem they hadn't anticipated. What do you do when someone powerful enough refuses to play by your rules? Universal Pictures could have canceled the distribution deal. They had the legal right. The clause was clear. But canceling would mean admitting why they were canceling. It would mean publicly acknowledging the blacklist's existence, which the industry had always denied. It would mean explaining why a writer's name was so dangerous that it warranted destroying a $12 million film. And that explanation would raise questions they didn't want to answer. So Universal Pictures did nothing. They released Spartacus as planned. Dalton Trumbo's name appeared in the credits. And the blacklist, which had seemed unbreakable just hours before, began to crack. But Kirk Douglas paid a price. He paid it slowly, in ways that didn't make headlines. Scripts that would have come to him went to other actors. Producers who would have taken his calls stopped returning them. Social invitations dried up. He was never formally blacklisted himself, that would have been too obvious, but he was marked as someone who couldn't be trusted to maintain the system. He was marked as dangerous. Years later, Kirk Douglas would say that the press conference was the easiest decision he ever made. But the people who were there, who saw his lawyers grabbing his arm, who saw the studio executives flee the room, who saw Lew Wasserman's blank face calculating the cost, they knew different. They knew it was one of the hardest decisions Kirk Douglas ever made. They knew he chose to make it anyway. Dalton Trumbo died in 1976, 17 years after that press conference. He lived long enough to see his name restored, to work openly again, to receive credit for the screenplays he had written in secret. He lived long enough to thank Kirk Douglas publicly, in interviews and articles, for being the one who broke the silence. Kirk Douglas lived until 2020. He was 103 years old when he died. In his final years, people would ask him about Spartacus, about the blacklist, about that January morning in 1959. And he would always come back to the same point: it wasn't about heroism. It wasn't about politics. It was about the simple idea that a writer deserves credit for their work. But it was also about something larger. It was about the moment when someone with power chose to use it not to protect themselves, but to break a system that had controlled Hollywood for a decade. It was about 3 words that cost $350,000 and changed everything. The ballroom of the Beverly Hilton was empty an hour after the press conference ended. The chairs were folded up. The cameras were packed away. The journalists had rushed off to file their stories. But the room still felt different somehow, like the air itself had shifted. Kirk Douglas sat alone in his car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before driving away. He didn't cry. He didn't celebrate. He just sat there, feeling the weight of what he had done settle over him like a coat. Heavy, but necessary. Expensive, but worth it. In the weeks that followed, Kirk Douglas would receive letters. Some praised him. Some condemned him. Some came from writers whose names had been erased, thanking him for speaking theirs. Some came from studio executives, explaining in carefully worded language why he had made a terrible mistake. He kept all the letters. He kept them in a box that he rarely opened but never threw away. Because those letters proved something important, that saying 3 words had mattered. That breaking the blacklist had been worth whatever it cost. Hollywood changed after that January morning. Slowly, grudgingly, but it changed. Other writers on the blacklist began to see their names restored. Other actors and directors found the courage to speak up. The system that had seemed permanent started to crumble. And it all began with Kirk Douglas leaning into a microphone and saying, "Written by Dalton Trumbo." 3 words. 11 syllables. One decision that proved sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply tell the truth, no matter what it costs.